So Saddam was basically doing the same exact thing as the criminal government in the United States is doing, bringing in cheap labor from elsewhere while starving out the middle class. So just like the criminal regime in control of the United States, Saddam only allows certain people to succeed. He only allowed certain people into government positions. He only allowed certain people to be given loans, and whoever did not like it was killed. So Saddam favored his branch of the Muslim religion called the Sunnis, and he persecuted the other large branch of the Muslim religion called the Shias or the Shiites. So the Sunnis and the Shias were basically like the Baptists and Presbyterians, who have slightly different beliefs within their religion. So during the Iraq-Iran war, Saddam persecuted the Shiites and the Kurds, taking the houses and lands away from 70,000 people. Now the Kurds are a very large group of people who once had their own country, but it was broken up between Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey when those countries were formed. So the Kurds no longer had their own country after Europe had carved up the Middle East. Then the Kurds were caught under the rule of these royal families, and under dictators like Saddam, they didn't do much better. Because after all, it was the same group in control, whether it was the king of Iraq or dictator Saddam Hussein. So the Kurds were a divided people living under 4 different nations. So they had very little political influence and were subject to tyrannical dictators like Saddam. Now you could watch the news for 1,000 years, and you could look up stuff on the internet for 1,000 more. Yet most will never fully explain the cause of the war between Iraq and Iran. But it was over Iraq's access to the ocean. Iraq wanted its country to extend down to the ocean called the Persian Gulf. That way, Iraq could easily put their oil on ships and then ship it all over the world. So you can see on your map that at the bottom of Iraq is a small country called Kuwait, and that is right between Iraq and the ocean. Now Kuwait was run by a royal family and was protected by the Western power establishment. So the U.S. and Europe said to Saddam, if you want access to the ocean, you cannot invade Kuwait, because Kuwait is part of our royal cult. However, if you want to go invade the Republic of Iran and take over a place called Khuzestan, then you will have land on the ocean, and the U.S. will give you as much weapons, supplies, and money you need as long as you invade and attack another republic called Iran. So after being attacked by Iraq, Iran began to support the Kurds who lived in northern Iraq and hated Saddam. Once again, the Kurds were a group of people who lost their land when it was divided up between Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey. And so they were oppressed without an independent government to represent themselves. And the Kurds hated Saddam, who did nothing but persecute them. So the Kurdish rebels, backed by Iran, began to fight Saddam. So I'll quote a well-known encyclopedia on the internet. I quote, in 1982, Reagan removed Iraq from the list of countries that supported terrorism and sold weapons such as howitzers to Iraq through Jordan and Israel. France sold Iraq millions of dollars worth of weapons, including helicopters, fighter planes, and missiles. Both the U.S. and West Germany sold Iraq dual-use pesticides and poisons that would be used to create chemical and other weapons. So, Saddam was not only funded by the U.S. and Europe, but also by the royal houses in the Middle East too. And Saddam received great deals of money from the royal families of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait to attack the Republic of Iran. So the war was between Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Jordan, Israel, the U.S. and Europe versus Iran and the Kurds. Now let's talk about Iran. Around the start of the Iraq-Iran war, an exiled religious leader named Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile. He had been kicked out of Iran by the royal family, but was allowed back in after the revolution. So Khomeini was a Shia Muslim. He basically was the Islamic leader in Iran, while others controlled the military. The Iranians had a pretty big military and an impressive air force, which managed to hold off the Iraqis. The Iraq-Iran war was a terrible war that went on for 8 years and took more than 1 million people's lives. Because the Kurds supported Iran and constantly participated in the war against Saddam, Saddam began to use chemical weapons received from the U.S. on Iranian towns and Kurdish Iraqi villages. In 1988, Saddam ordered the genocide of several 100,000 Iraqi Kurds and the destruction of villages, towns, and cities. The West began to supply Saddam with laser-guided bombs and scud missiles that he used on Iranian cities and economic targets like Iranian oil fields and oil tankers. And Iran began to see that the international community, in other words, the United Nations and the Western power establishment, had no intention of restraining Iraq whatsoever. In fact, quite the opposite, as the West was equipping Saddam with all the weapons he needed to attack Iran. So the war finally ended in a stalemate, which meant nobody won, and Saddam was largely in debt to the central bank and U.S. weapons dealers. And he was probably pissed off that he never got his oceanfront property. And even though Kuwait and Saudi Arabia had given him money to fight Iran, Saddam said, look, I don't think I need to repay you guys back because you also hate Iran. Iran's your enemy too, but I did all the fighting. So since I was fighting your enemies for you, you should just pay me to fight them. And after some more moves, Saddam basically made the U.S. aware that he wanted to invade Kuwait next so that he could get access to the ocean that way. If he couldn't get it through Iran, then Saddam would get it through Kuwait. So the U.S. acted like they were going to look the other way and let Saddam invade Kuwait, because after all, they had been the ones supporting him all along with everything he needed to be a ruthless military dictator. So in July of 1990, Saddam invaded Kuwait and took over and held it for 6 months until January of 91, when the U.S. military drove the Iraqi military out of Kuwait. Then the U.S. attacked Iraq. The U.S. attacked Iraq, blowing up electric power stations, oil refineries, petrochemical complexes, telecommunication centers, highways, bridges, roads, railroads, radio and TV stations, or in other words, everything that the West had loaned the money for, the West then blew up. So the Iraqis could not understand why this was. They could understand that the U.S. would kick them out of Kuwait, but the Iraqis did not understand why the U.S. and the West would give them all this money to develop Iraq just to destroy it all a few years later. And if that wasn't insane enough, after blowing up Iraq, the U.S. military let Saddam remain in power, the guy who decided to invade Kuwait to begin with. So this all highlights that the U.S. did not mind Saddam causing all this chaos. So the U.S. military could then step in and not only blow up Kuwait, but also destroy Iraq that just got done renovating itself. And you know who stepped in then? The World Bank credit card company, who again had loans for Saudi Arabia, for Kuwait, and everyone else who needed a loan to rebuild their country after their U.S. military force got done blowing everything up. So you could see how Saddam, the U.S. military, and the World Bank all function so well together. And the last note about the Kuwait War is this. The U.S. military told the Kurdish rebels of Iraq that they would receive help if they attacked Saddam. So the Kurds did this. They backed up America. And with all the bloodshed, not one U.S. soldier was killed in Kurdish territories. And for all their bravery and support, when the U.S. pulled out of Iraq, they left Saddam in power. Saddam took all of his anger out on the Kurds who had helped the Americans. And Saddam used chemical weapons and bombs to kill thousands more of Kurdish rebels and Kurdish civilians. Then the U.S. decided to invade Iraq again in 2003. At this point, the U.S. military said that their puppet Saddam Hussein was now a part of the Al-Qaeda terrorist group and had access to weapons of mass destruction, which included chemical and biological weapons. Now, the U.S. military had been the ones providing Saddam with every weapon he owned. So the U.S. knew exactly what type of weapon Saddam had because the U.S. government had been Saddam's weapons dealers. So the U.S. acted like they were on this big investigation to promote safety everywhere and go into Iraq to see if Saddam actually had weapons of mass destruction. Meanwhile, the U.S. media controlled the whole debate by using the weak complaint against the military that the military cannot find these weapons. So where were all these chemical weapons and weapons of mass destruction? So at first, this fake debate paints the U.S. as the good guys, searching for dangerous weapons, instead of what they were, the criminal regime that provided Saddam with weapons of mass destruction. And when the U.S. could not find them all, maybe it's because Saddam used a lot of these chemical and biological weapons on the people of Iran and even on his own citizens. So after making the decision to invade Iraq again, the U.S. military first began to train the Kurds. So the Kurds welcomed the U.S. military again, who they saw as the good guys, finally there to remove an oppressive dictator. The Kurds did not know that the U.S. had been providing Saddam with all these weapons he used to attack them from the start. So the U.S. military took control of Iraq's capital, Baghdad, and arrested all their little buddies in Saddam's regime. The U.S. military tore down Saddam's statue and killed about 4,000 civilians. Then the U.S. military set up martial law, where they patrolled Baghdad, destroying city property and landmarks, raiding museums, disrespecting Iraqi culture, and committing all forms of criminal actions. They beat people up, they kicked in the doors of civilians at night, and sometimes raped little girls and set their families on fire to hide what they'd done. All of this, of course, made the Iraqis hate the Americans instead of respect them, and more Iraqis fought the U.S. military. And then the U.S. military got to rape and kill even more people. In December of 2003, the U.S. located Saddam living in a small house on a farm. Without his servants, this U.S.-sponsored insider could barely clean up after himself and was living like a psychotic homeless person among piles of garbage, as you could see on the 60 Minutes broadcast on Finding Hussein.